Since the end of the Second World War, through the Cold War, and to the present day, two economic systems ingrained themselves into societal conscience: capitalism and communism. It's undeniable that these two systems influenced the modern world tremendously, especially in the last century. Few ideas were as prevalent and impacting to the public's opinion, resulting in economic debates mainly focusing on capitalism's free market and communism's state-run economy. Maybe with all the variants of the two, like social democracy or state capitalism, but something entirely different, alternate, and distinguished is regarded as foolish if even considered at all. Yet during the first half of the last century, a rivaling model gained momentum and found implementation in various nations, like Austria, Portugal, Italy, Argentina, and others. Corporatism. Most of you probably haven't heard of it before, or associate it with the rule of corporations. Yet this couldn't be further from the truth. That would be corporatocracy. Thus I will explain the model at its core, its history, and its results. When the Industrial Revolution gained momentum in America and Europe during the mid-19th century, the entire existing social order got shaken to its core. With the previous foundations of mostly rural agrarian characteristics gone, the focus of the population shifted to the cities. Its unregulated nature, overcrowding, and overall inexperience with this new society caused widespread poverty. The rise of slums and non-existence of social security showcased that society couldn't go on like it. As a result, new ideas quickly rose, most notably communism, as you probably know. But besides that, other approaches against the given status quo of capitalism also arose. At the forefront stood the Roman Catholic Church, which resulted in the publication of the Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII in 1893, essentially proposing an economic model based on class cooperation instead of communism's dictatorship of the proletariat or capitalism's reign of the bourgeoisie. This new society would be free of conflict between lower and upper classes, instead focusing on cooperation for national good. In contrast to its two counterparts, capitalism and communism, corporatism holds the advantage of being proposed to balance a realistic society and not to achieve a utopia the proponents had never even seen themselves. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, never knowing what societal upheaval would follow, and Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital in the worst stage of the Industrial Revolution, dying before witnessing the first improvement that occurred naturally. Corporatism as a movement now started in the 1880s and 1890s, when industrialization in the West was nearly complete. Corporatism derives from the Latin word corpus, meaning body, and this essentially sums up the idea behind it perfectly. State and economy are each regarded as a body. As we all know, a body relies on the function of its various organs. A body can't work with one organ malfunctioning or failing. Thus, all need to work together. In case of society, the body is the state, and the organs the comprising industries. The idea is that everyone, independently of his status, works with society as a whole to achieve prosperity. The upper classes are needed for leadership and the lower classes for implementation. One group needs to plan and another needs to act. Alone they couldn't. Let's say a factory wants to make a new product. The owner has already envisioned how to conquer the market, and the workers have already started production. Both are doing their share, equally important, and yet, alone, the work would be in vain. And that sums it all up. There is no dominance of one class, but the brotherhood of them all. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, sounds pretty good in theory, but so does communism at first. Where's the proof that it can work? Well, the viewer, there are some. Let's start with Portugal. It's probably a prime example of a corporatist success story. At the beginning of the 20th century, the country basically slipped from crisis to crisis. Having barely recovered from the Napoleonic invasion in 1807, a civil war from 1832 to 34, the sudden death of Pedro V in 1861, the assassination of King Carlos in 1908, the overthrow of King Manuel II, and the establishment of a turbulent republic all followed mercilessly. When then in 1933, a university professor named Antonio Oliveira de Salazar took over the government, the country seemed on its deathbed. And yet, the corporatist policies of Salazar's Estado Novo would prove otherwise. His reign saw stabilization of the escudo, the Portuguese currency, reduction of inflation, budget surpluses, combating foreign debt, expanding infrastructure, rising literacy rate, and living expectancy, which can all be attributed to his policies. Secondly, there's Austria, which saw complete economic collapse due to the forced dissolvement of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the reparations of the Treaty of Saint-Germain. The succeeding republic was plagued by an overstretched bureaucracy, communist uprisings, and paralyzed institutions. A brief civil war in 1934 resulted in the rise of the Vaterlandsfront under the leadership of Engelbert Dollfuss, heavily influenced by the Quadragesimo Anno by Pope Pius XI. Besides suppressing socialist uprisings and a national socialist coup, very based, the regime saw great reduction of unemployment, subsidization of housing, social and health insurances, formation of medieval-inspired guilds, and many more, which they all just achieved in 4 years. Bear in mind with the assassination of Dollfuss and eventual Anschluss of Austria into the German Reich in 1938, which is a pretty impressive task. And at last there's Italy. Yes, fascist Italy to be precise. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, they were fascist, but they are still corporatists if you think about that. Did they fuse it with national syndicalism and did they kind of went on their own path with a complete state centralization and more secular approach? Yes, but is it still kind of corporatism? Yes, we can't discredit that they did record some achievements like the draining of the Pontine Marches resulting in the recovery of 80,000 hectares of arable land, protection of the Italian economy during the Great Depression through the IRI, dropping of illiteracy to 21% in 10 years, combat of corruption and the mafia, and so on. Of course, these are just some of many other examples, like Smetana's Lithuania, Perón's Argentina, and Vargas' Brazil. But you get the point. So, why did corporatism ultimately fell out of favor? Well, the answer is like with so many others, World War II. The fascist branch was the most prominent during the interwar and war period. Thus, over time, it became interchangeable with fascism and authoritarianism in general, which essentially ruined its image. However, if you look closely, it never actually fell out of favor. Take a look at Cold War Europe and you realize the concept was still pretty much implemented, but not under the name of corporatism. Yet at its core, the principle of cooperation between employer, employee and state still remained. And nowadays the Nordic model of Scandinavia is somewhat in a liberal and pluralistic form, a continuation of corporatism. But more on that in another video.